If you lived in Wandsworth, you knew the Ram Brewery by its smell, malt and hops drifting north across the rooftops, and the great Shire horses pulling drays of beer through the streets the way they had for longer than anyone alive could remember. They'd been brewing on that spot since before the Spanish Armada, 4¼ centuries, beside a little river called the Wandle, with a live ram for a mascot and a stable in the middle of London. They survived the Tudor age and the dissolution of the monasteries, survived a fire that gutted the brewhouse, survived the Blitz, the keg revolution that was meant to kill cask ale forever, and wave after wave of consolidation that swallowed every rival. And then, after more than 400 years of brewing, the fires went out. How does a brewery that outlasted everything, that won every argument it ever fought, simply fall silent? Chapter 1. The Smell of the Wind. If you lived in Wandsworth in the 1980s, you could tell which way the wind was blowing without looking up. From the south came coffee, the roasted warmth of the Kenko works. From the east, the sharp juniper bite of a gin distillery. And from the north, drifting across the rooftops and down the terraced streets, came the smell of malt and hops, sweet, heavy, unmistakable. That was the Ram. That was beer being made the way it had been made on that exact patch of ground for longer than anyone could properly remember. All three of those smells are gone now. The coffee, the gin, the beer. But the beer had been there the longest by far, and its leaving was the one that broke hearts. The story begins, as so many of these stories do, with something almost too small to notice. A court record, a crime. In 1576, in the assize courts that handled serious offences across the county of Surrey, a man named Humphrey Langridge appears in the documents. He is described as a beer brewer at Wandsworth, and he is in the records because his premises had been burgled. That is the first hard evidence. The first thing a historian can point to and say, with confidence, here, brewing was happening. 5 years later, in 1581, the same Langridge turns up again, this time named as the landlord of an establishment called the Ram. There is something fitting about it. The proof that Britain's oldest brewery existed at all is not a brewing ledger or a proud founder's portrait. It is the report of a theft. Somebody, 4½ centuries ago, thought there was something on those premises worth stealing. Now, the truth about that founding date is more tangled than the brewery's own publicity ever liked to admit, and it deserves saying plainly. Some sources put brewing on the site from 1581. Others say 1576, the year of the burglary. The company's own later materials sometimes claimed brewing since at least 1533, when a family called the Rydens reputedly held the place. A brewery in Faversham, Kent, called Shepherd Neame, has long disputed the whole claim and insists it is England's oldest brewer. The argument, like the argument over Britain's oldest pub, will never be settled, and probably shouldn't be. What we know for certain is this. On a patch of ground beside the little River Wandle, 100 yards from where it meets the Thames, people were brewing beer when Elizabeth I sat on the throne, and they never really stopped. Not for 400 years. The Wandle was the reason. Clean water, running fast, ideal for brewing, and a river mouth where barges could bring in coal and malt and carry finished beer away. Wandsworth in those days wasn't London at all. It was a village in Surrey, and it would stay that way until 1889. Beer left the site by barge down the Thames, and later by horse-drawn wagon along the Surrey Iron Railway, that strange early freight line that ran from Wandsworth to Croydon. The ownership of the Ram passed down the centuries like a relay baton. The Langridge family held it for 90 years and more. Then the Drapers, from the 1670s. Then, in 1763, a man named Thomas Tritton, and after him, his son George. For 200 years, the beer kept flowing, and the names on the deeds kept changing, and none of it would have mattered to history at all, except that George Tritton happened to be a shareholder in that Surrey Iron Railway. And among his fellow shareholders was a Southwark manufacturer of brewing equipment named Florence Young. Florence Young had a son. The son was a cooper by trade, a barrel maker, a man who understood the vessels beer lived in. His name was Charles Allen Young, and in 1831 he would buy the Ram Brewery and give it the name it would carry to its grave. Chapter 2. Young and Bainbridge. Charles Allen Young did not buy the brewery alone. He went in with a partner, a man called Anthony Fothergill Bainbridge, and together, in 1831, they purchased the Ram Brewery from the Tritton family. The price, by most accounts, was £1,500, and for that they got not just the brew house and the land, but 82 tied public houses, pubs that were contractually bound to sell the brewery's beer. It was a substantial concern. It was also, almost immediately, very nearly a catastrophe. The two men divided the work between them. Bainbridge took the lead on the actual brewing, the day-to-day craft of turning malt and water and hops into beer. Young, the cooper's son with the family money behind him, provided the financial backing and the commercial sense. It was a sensible arrangement, and it was barely a year old when the brewhouse caught fire. In 1832, most of the building burned. Imagine it, the partnership not yet 2 years established, the £1,500 barely settled, and the heart of the operation reduced to a smoking shell beside the Wandle. A lesser pair might have walked away, taken the insurance, counted it as a bad bet. Young and Bainbridge rebuilt. And not only did they rebuild, they modernised. By 1835, just 3 years after the fire, they had installed a steam engine. That steam engine matters more than almost anything else in this story, because a version of it would still be running, still in its original spot, well over a century later. It was built by a local firm, Wentworth and Sons of Wandsworth, and every single part of it was made by hand. The original engine of 1835 produced 12 horsepower, later uprated to 16. It is thought to be the oldest beam engine of its type anywhere in the world, still standing where it was first installed, never once having been out of working order. When its original high-pressure piston was finally retired in 1945, after 110 years of labour, it went to the Science Museum. A second, larger Wentworth engine arrived in 1867, producing 20 horsepower, and it ran for 12 hours a day, every single day, for 109 years, until 1976. Think about that rhythm. 12 hours a day, every day, for 109 years. A machine breathing in and out beside a London river while empires rose and fell, while the village of Wandsworth swelled into a London borough, while the horse gave way to the lorry and the gaslight gave way to electricity. The engine just kept going. Charles Allen Young died in 1855, and his son, Charles Florence Young, stepped into the partnership. The Young-Bainbridge arrangement, by then in its second generation, was formally dissolved in 1883. The Bainbridge family left the business, and the firm carried on under a single name, Young and Company. It was incorporated as Young and Comers Brewery Limited in 1890 and listed on the London Stock Exchange in 1898, a family firm, now a public company, but with the family's hands still firmly on the controls. That arrangement, the family grip on a public company, would one day become the very thing the story turned on. But that was a long way off. For now, the ram was rising. Chapter 3. The Stubborn Faith. To understand what the Ram Brewery became, you have to understand the man who came to embody it. And to understand him, you have to start with the fact that he had no business surviving the war, let alone running a brewery for 44 years afterwards. John Allen Young was born in Winchester in August 1921. Brewing ran in his blood from both directions. He was the great-great-grandson of the founder, Charles Allen Young, and his mother came from the Simons brewing family of Reading. He was educated at the Nautical College at Pangbourne, and when the Second World War came, he served as a Fleet Air Arm fighter pilot. By 24, he had reached the rank of lieutenant commander. He flew in Operation Pedestal, the desperate convoy that relieved the siege of Malta. He flew over the North Africa landings and out to the Far East. Across the war, he flew 25 different types of aircraft and landed on 6 aircraft carriers, a profession in which a great many men his age did not survive. He survived. He went up to Corpus Christi College, Cambridge, read economics, and in 1954 joined the family firm. In 1962, when his father William retired, John Young became chairman and chief executive. He was 41 years old. He would hold the chairmanship until the day he died, 44 years later. The oldest and longest-serving chairman in the entire British brewing industry, and almost immediately he did something that everyone around him thought was madness. It was the 1960s, and British brewing was being remade from top to bottom. The great national brewers, the so-called Big Six, had discovered something they believed was the future. Keg beer, filtered, pasteurized, artificially carbonated, pumped from a sealed metal container with a uniform fizz and an endless shelf life. Watney's Red Barrel, Worthington E. Whitbread Tankard. The advertising was everywhere. The investment was enormous. This was modern beer, convenient beer, beer that didn't need a skilled cellarman to look after it. The old way, cask ale, living beer that continued to ferment in the barrel and had to be nursed by hand in the pub cellar, was treated as a relic, a quaint embarrassment soon to be swept away. John Young looked at all of this and he refused. He kept brewing cask ale. He kept the living beer, the difficult beer, the beer that needed care. Rival directors, by the accounts that survive, laughed him to scorn. Here was a man turning his back on the future, clinging to a method the entire industry had decided was finished. He was right, and they were wrong, and it took about a decade to prove it. In 1971, 4 young men who were furious about what was happening to British beer founded an organisation called the Campaign for Real Ale, CAMRA. What had been one stubborn brewer's article of faith suddenly became a movement, then a cause, then a genuine national revival. Drinkers who had never thought about where their beer came from began demanding the real thing, cask ale, properly kept, full of flavour and character. And there, having never wavered, having kept the faith through all the years of mockery, stood Youngs of Wandsworth. The beer writer Roger Protz would later call John Young the father of the real ale revolution. An iconoclast, Protz wrote, who simply believed in good traditional beer drunk in good traditional pubs. It is one of the quiet ironies of this whole story that the man would win his argument so completely. He would live to see cask ale triumphant, his judgment vindicated, his beer celebrated. He won. That makes what came later harder to bear, not easier. Chapter 4. The ram, the horses, and the man in the white suit. You could not really separate Young's the brewery from John Young, the man, and John Young the man was by any measure a magnificent eccentric. He held court at the company's annual general meetings dressed in a white suit, presiding over lavish affairs that were as much theatre as corporate governance. When an activist investor began circling the company, threatening its independence, Young came to the AGM armed with props. He produced a pair of boxing gloves. He wore a beekeeper's hat, he explained, to keep away annoying pests. He brought a loudhailer for the benefit of certain people who seemed to be ignoring what he had to say. The shareholders adored it. The press adored it. And behind the showmanship was a man who genuinely knew his business down to the cellar floor, who visited every single pub in his estate, who was on first-name terms with his landlords, and whose head brewer, Ken Don, once said that if Mr. John found the beer below par, he would kick my arse ragged. But the soul of the place, the thing that drew Wandsworth families to the brewery gates on a Sunday, was the animals. The Ram Brewery kept a ram, a live one, a Dorset horn, the very animal the company's trademark was based on. One of them was named Ramrod de Arcy. There were geese, there were peacocks, and there were horses, about a dozen great Shire dray horses, kept in Victorian stables, who pulled the wooden drays that delivered beer to the pubs within a few miles of the brewery. This was not a heritage gimmick bolted on for the tourists. The horses worked. They delivered beer through the streets of Wandsworth right up until 2006, by which time virtually every other brewery in the country had given up its horses decades before. John Young loved those horses with something close to devotion. He had been president of the Shire Horse Society in the early 1960s, kept as many as 24 black shires at one time in the brewery stables, and is genuinely credited with helping to save the Shire horse as a breed in Britain. The stables became, as one account put it, a sort of unofficial city farm. When the management tried, in 1997, to end the daily horse-drawn deliveries on grounds of cost, the public outcry was so fierce that the decision was simply overturned. The people of Wandsworth would not have it. There is a story John Young liked to tell that captures him perfectly. The brewery horses, under one regulation or another, were required to have passports. But the horses, he complained, could not fit into a photo booth, and so a vet had to be employed to sketch each animal by hand. He told it as a joke about red tape, but it tells you everything about the world he was running. A Victorian working stable, full of living animals, colliding with the paperwork of the modern age. And the beer was very good. Young's Bitter, the session flagship, the everyday pint. There was a moment when a rival brewery, Fuller's, ran a bus advertisement reading nothing ordinary about Fuller's, a dig at the fact that Young's Bitter was affectionately known as the Ordinary. John Young, the story goes, threatened to sack a brewer for using the word. There was Young's Special, the best bitter, the Spesh. There was the Winter Warmer, beloved in the cold months. There was Ramrod at 5%, named for the mascot. And in 1997 came a beer that would become a genuine cult hit, especially in America, Double Chocolate Stout, brewed with real dark chocolate and chocolate malt, rich enough to silence a room. The hallmark of all of it was a refusal to cut corners. The head brewer Ken Don was among a group of brewers who gave farmers contracts to grow Maris Otter, a traditional malting barley that was harder to grow and lower yielding than modern varieties, and in doing so helped save it from extinction. Fuggles and Golding's hops, open square fermentation, hard London water, the old ways, kept alive not out of nostalgia but because they made better beer. Chapter 5. The height of it. By the turn of the millennium, Young's stood as something that should not really have been able to exist, and yet did, gloriously. Here was a Victorian brewery on a cramped 5.5-acre site in the middle of a London one-way system, still brewing cask ale by traditional methods, still delivering some of it by horse, run by a man in a white suit who had flown fighters over Malta. It supplied more than 200 pubs across London and the southwest. Its beers reached the free trade, the supermarkets and export markets in Europe, the United States, Canada and Japan. The Special London Ale, a bottle-conditioned ale at 6.4%, won a gold medal at CAMRA's Great British Beer Festival in 1999. The royal recognition came too. In 1981, the brewery's 150th anniversary was marked by a visit from the Queen herself. And in 1987, at the Queen's Head, the Queen Mother poured and drank a pint of Young's and pronounced it, in a verdict that delighted the whole company, better than champagne. The brewery had survived an extraordinary amount to reach this height. It had come through the Tudor era and the dissolution of the monasteries. It had survived the fire of 1832 and another major fire in the 1880s. It had come through 2 world wars. The brewery was partially destroyed by German bombing during the Blitz and rebuilt. It had survived the keg revolution that was supposed to kill cask ale forever. It had survived the lager boom. It had survived wave after wave of consolidation that swallowed up regional brewery after regional brewery across Britain. In 1984, the company had invested in a brand new £5 million brewhouse, so that by the new century the site was a strange and wonderful mixture of the ancient and the ultra-modern. The hand-built Wentworth engine of 1835 in one building, gleaming new stainless steel in the next. For 4.25 centuries, the Ram had never stopped. It had brewed under Elizabeth I, and it was brewing under Elizabeth II. It had outlasted every threat the world could throw at it, and standing at that summit, in the warm certainty of a battle won and a tradition preserved, almost nobody inside those walls could see the one thing that would finally bring it down. It would not be a fire. It would not be a war or a competitor or a change in taste. It would be the ground itself, the simple, fatal fact that the land the Ram stood on had quietly become worth more than the beer could ever be. Chapter 6. The Investor at the Gate. The trouble with winning is that it makes you valuable. And the trouble with being valuable, in a London that was changing faster than anyone could quite keep up with, was that somebody would always come to collect. Through the 1990s, while the beer won prizes and the horses pulled their drays through Wandsworth, a quieter problem was settling over the Ram. The brewery was running well below what it could produce. On that old, split-level, multi-storey urban site, the brewhouse was operating at as little as 60% of its capacity. To fill the gap, Young's took in contract work, brewing other companies' beer to keep the vessels busy. Beers like Courage Best and Mackeson Stout. It kept the place ticking over. But it was a symptom, and the people watching the company closely knew how to read symptoms. One of those people was Blake Nixon, who ran the British end of an aggressive investment outfit called the Guinness Peat Group. From the late 1990s into the 2000s, the Guinness Peat Group bought into Young's and began, year after year, to push at the company's defences. Those defences were unusual. Young's had a dual share structure, a class of voting shares held by the family, which meant that no matter how many ordinary shares an outsider accumulated, the family kept control. It was the mechanism that had protected the brewery's independence for over a century, and Guinness Peat Group wanted it gone. The loyal shareholders, and there were many, including an organisation called the CAMRA Investment Club, drinkers who had bought shares precisely to defend the brewery, believed they understood what the investors were really after. Not better dividends, not improved efficiency. The land, the 5.5 acres of riverside Wandsworth that the brewery happened to be sitting on. Because Wandsworth, by now, was transforming. This was the deeper current beneath everything. The borough was gentrifying at extraordinary speed. The beer writer and broadcaster Michael Jackson once described it as white flight in reverse. The middle classes flooding back into an inner London riverside district within easy reach of the city. Land that had been worth very little when it held a working brewery and a stable full of horses was now worth a great deal indeed. Across the Thames basin, the same arithmetic was already claiming victims. Morell's of Oxford had gone in 1998. Breakspeare's of Henley had stopped brewing in 2002. Its site converted to flats. Both had been worth more as property than as breweries. The pattern was visible to anyone who cared to look. For 4 years and more, the Guinness Peat Group's resolutions were voted down at those theatrical annual meetings. The boxing gloves, the loud hailer, the white suit, the cheering shareholders. John Young held the line, as he had held the line on Cascale 40 years before. But the campaign did something quieter and more lasting than any single vote. It put the value of the land squarely, permanently, on the table. It made everyone inside the company think about what the ground was worth. And John Young, the last bulwark against a sale, the man whose resolve held the whole structure together, was getting old. He was in his early 80s now, and he was dying of cancer. Everyone could see it. The question that hung over the brewery was no longer whether the beer was good or whether the horses would keep running. The question was, what would happen when the man in the white suit was no longer there to say no? Chapter 7. The Review. In November 2003, the board of Young & Company commissioned a review of the future of its brewing operations. It sounds like the most ordinary thing in the world, a company examining its options. But everyone connected to the Ram understood that the review was the beginning of something, and that whatever it concluded, the years of certainty were over. The man driving the process was the chief executive, Stephen Goodyear. He was not a villain in this story, and it would be a disservice to the truth to paint him as one. He was a man looking at a genuinely difficult set of facts. The brewing review examined around 6 options: build an entirely new brewery, enter a joint venture, contract the brewing out, or stop brewing on the site altogether. And the case against staying put was, in cold commercial terms, formidable. The Ram site was awkward in every direction. It was a labour-intensive, multi-level Victorian complex spread across buildings of different ages, stuck inside the Wandsworth one-way system so that lorries struggled to get in and out. There were health and safety concerns. There were the constraints of the listed buildings. The very heritage that made the place magnificent also made it nearly impossible to redevelop or rationalise. The brewhouse, even with the 1984 investment, was running at well under capacity on a site that simply could not be made efficient. Goodyear laid it out plainly. It would be uneconomic to keep pouring investment into the old Ram. So the review hung over the workforce for 2 years. 2 years of uncertainty, of rumour, of men and women coming in to brew the beer their families had brewed for generations, while not knowing whether the gates would be open the following year. John Hatch, one of the brewers, would later describe that period. The not knowing, the slow gathering of dread. The brewery still smelled of malt every morning. The horses still went out. But something had shifted, and everyone could feel it. There is a temptation, looking back, to imagine that the council forced it, that some compulsory purchase order or municipal scheme drove the brewery out. The truth is more uncomfortable than that. Wandsworth Council had regeneration plans for the town centre, and they added to the general sense that change was coming. But the council issued no compulsory purchase order. It was in no particular hurry. Some who knew the site well, including the beer writer Paul Bailey, would later argue that the official justification, that there was no room to expand, that the site could not work, was, in his blunt phrase, complete and utter nonsense. The brewery was not being driven out by force. A decision was being made, and the people making it were the people who had always protected the place. Chapter 8. My head has ruled my heart. On the 23rd of May 2006, in the brewery's 175th year under the Young family, the company announced what it had decided. Brewing at the Ram would end. The brewing operations would be merged with those of Charles Wells, a family brewer in Bedford, around 50 miles to the north, into a new joint venture called the Wells & Youngs Brewing Company. Charles Wells would own 60% of it. Youngs would hold 40%. The new company would begin operations on the 2nd of October, and the Ram Brewery, the oldest continuously brewing site in Britain, beside the Wandle, where someone had been making beer since before the Spanish Armada, would close. The two firms were not strangers. They were old friends. Paul Wells, the chairman of Charles Wells, said simply that his father had known John Young for many years. Both were family brewers. Both had kept faith with cask ale. And Bedford's brewery, a modern 16-acre plant built in 1976, had spare capacity, the very thing the Ram lacked. On paper, the fit was almost perfect. Ken Don, Young's head brewer, would go to Bedford as a consultant to oversee the transfer of the recipes, to make sure that the beer that came out of the Eagle Brewery tasted like the beer that had come out of the Ram. Every effort would be made to honour the craft. That was real, and it mattered, but there was no disguising what it was. John Young himself did not try to disguise it. In the announcement, the man who had stood at AGM after AGM and vowed, "I will not be selling this brewery," the man who had fought the Guinness Peak Group to a standstill for years, chose his words with the honesty of someone who knew he was near the end. The decision to sell the Ram Brewery site in their 175th year, he said, had been taken with some reluctance, for mainly nostalgic reasons. And then the line that says everything. As I promised when we first announced this in 2003, my head has ruled my heart. His head had ruled his heart. The man who was the heart of the place said so himself. In August, the second decision landed, the one that revealed the true scale of the numbers. Youngs sold the Ram Brewery site and its nearby offices to a property developer, Minerva, for £69 million. £69 million. That was what the ground was worth. That was the figure against which 425 years of brewing had finally been weighed and found, in the language of the balance sheet, wanting. The money did not vanish. The company poured it into pubs, buying up more and more of the estate. But the meaning was unmistakable. The beer had not failed. The beer was loved. The land had simply become worth more than the thing that made it sacred. The campaign for real ale, the movement John Young had unwittingly fathered, did not stay quiet. Its chief executive, Mike Benner, called the closure the death of more than 4 centuries of brewing tradition in Wandsworth, and demanded guarantees that the beers and the pubs would be protected. Michael Jackson, the beer hunter, the most respected beer writer in the world, wrote an elegy he called The Silence of the Ram. He compared moving Youngs out of Wandsworth to moving the Carnegie Deli to Poughkeepsie, taking something whose entire identity was bound to its place and putting it somewhere it could never truly belong. And he described watching John Young bless the deal at the final annual meeting, frail and dying, like Captain Ahab lashed to the mast of his own ship. Chapter 9. The Last Brew. The end came faster than anyone wanted, and it came with a cruelty of timing that no scriptwriter would dare invent. The last brew at the Ram was completed on the 18th of September, 2006. The day before that, on the 17th of September, John Young died. He was 85. The cancer that everyone had watched gaining on him for years finally took him at his home in West Sussex, the day before the final brew ran out of the brewery he had given his life to. The man and the brewery, in the end, died in the same week. He did not have to watch the gates close for the last time. Perhaps that was a mercy. The brewery formally closed at the end of business on Monday the 25th of September, and on the 29th, 4 days after the closure, 12 days after he died, they buried John Young. At his funeral, they served beer from the last brew the Ram ever made, the final beer from 4 1/4 centuries of brewing, drunk in his memory by the people who had made it. John Hatch, who was there for all of it, said something afterwards that has stayed with everyone who has told this story since. In that summer, he said, he had never seen so many grown men reduced to tears. It was, he said, like losing a family. And in a literal sense, it was. Youngs had employed whole families, generation after generation. When the brewery shut, Hatch recalled, 4 generations of one particular family were working there at the same time. The grandfather, the father, the son, the grandson. All of them in the same week, watching the thing their family had defined itself by simply stop. The company said around 90 jobs would be cut. Hatch remembered it differently from the inside. Perhaps 300 brewery staff who took early retirement were relocated or had to find work elsewhere. The decommissioning took about 7 months. The horse-drawn drays kept making their deliveries through Wandsworth until April 2007, the great shires going out through the streets one last spring, long after the beer behind them had stopped being brewed on the site. The head office hung on until June, then moved, as Hatch put it, round the corner. The animals left the stables, the dozen shires, the ram, the geese, the peacocks. The unofficial city farm that Wandsworth families had visited on Sundays for decades emptied out. A working brewery with horses and a live ram in the middle of London, a thing that should not have survived into the 21st century but somehow had, was over. Chapter 10. The Man Who Wouldn't Let It Die. This is the part of the story that, by rights, should not exist at all, because one man refused to let the brewing stop. His name was John Hatch. He was Bristol-born, a biology graduate who had joined Young's as a microbiologist and risen to become a brewer. And in John Young's final years, Hatch had made the dying man a promise that he would keep brewing on the site while there was breath in his body. It was the kind of thing people say in moments of grief, the kind of promise that quietly evaporates once the lorries have gone and the offices have closed. Hatch meant it literally. The site now belonged to the developer, Minerva, and the redevelopment would not happen overnight. There were years of limbo ahead, so Hatch, with the permission of the chief executive Stephen Goodyear, granted on the strict condition that he use only scrap and sell nothing, set about doing something extraordinary. Working with a fellow brewer, Derek Prentice, he had first secretly fermented wort in bottles during the decommissioning, just to keep something alive. Then, after a low moment, standing at the oak tree planted in John Young's memory in King George's Park, he resolved to build a brewery out of nothing. He built it in 9 days, a scrap heap challenge nano brewery, assembled from salvaged equipment, cobbled together from the bones of the dead giant around him. The first batch was, by his own description, oily, rubbery and revolting. A welder named Terry Wilkins spat out the first pint on camera. Hatch refined the recipes, pouring his failures into a yucca plant that slowly died of them. He funded the whole thing through an honesty box and brewery tours, and he brewed at least one batch every week, every single week, for one reason and one reason only, so that the claim could still be made, technically and truthfully, that the Ram Brewery was the oldest site of continuous brewing in Britain. For 8 years he did this, employed first by Minerva and then by the next owners, brewing in a derelict brewery that had become a film set. The site was used for more than 120 productions: Luther, Silent Witness, the MasterChef Kitchen. Hatch brewed his weekly batch, he later said, with the sound of prop gun fire going off outside. One man, a tea urn, a pile of scrap, and a promise to a dead man, keeping 430 years of history alive in the ruins so that, when the time came, it could be passed on. The time came in 2020. By then, the great redevelopment had arrived. Minerva had sold the derelict site to the Greenland Group, a Chinese state-owned developer in its first-ever British acquisition, part of a scheme with a total investment value of around £600 million. The Ram Quarter, they called it. 661 new homes, a 36-storey tower, luxury flats on the ground where the horses had been stabled and the ram had grazed. But here is the thing the eulogist must say honestly, because it complicates the grief, and the truth is always more interesting than the lament. They did not erase it. The Grade 2-star listed brewery buildings were preserved. The Wentworth beam engines, including that 1835 engine, hand-built, never out of working order, were kept where they had always stood, integrated into the development as heritage. The brewhouse coppers, the brewer's house, the old stables, the brewery tap pub, all saved. The bank of the Wandle was opened to the public for the first time in centuries, and in 2020, an independent London brewer called Sambrooks, founded by a man named Duncan Sambrook in 2008, specifically to help fill the hole Young's had left in London brewing, moved into the listed buildings on a 20-year lease, installed a new brewery, and took over the torch that John Hatch had carried alone for 14 years. Beer is still made on the site of the Ram today. The oldest brewing site in Britain is, against every expectation, still brewing. As for Young's itself, the company did not die. This is the final irony, and it must be stated clearly because the company's survival is part of the truth. Young and Comer's Brewery is alive and thriving. It exited brewing entirely in 2011, selling its stake in the joint venture back to Charles Wells and became a pure pub operator. By the spring of 2025, it ran 278 managed pubs, employed over 7,000 people, and turned over close to £500 million a year. It no longer brews a single drop of beer. But the Ram, the Dorset horn, the mascot the trademark was based on, remains its logo to this day. The symbol of the brewery outlived the brewery. The beers themselves scattered to the wind. Charles Wells eventually sold the Young's brand to Marston's, and the beer that had been brewed beside the Wandle for centuries ended up being made in Wolverhampton, renamed London Original and London Special. Roger Protz, who had crowned John Young the father of the real ale revolution, tasted the modern version and called it, simply, a travesty. Chapter 11. What the Wind Carries. So, what do we make of it, in the end? Not a bankruptcy, not a collapse. The beer was good, better than champagne, a Queen Mother once said. The pubs were full. The cause John Young had fought for in the 1960s had triumphed so completely that cask ale was celebrated across the land. By every measure that a brewer would have understood, Young's had won. And it left Wandsworth anyway. That is the hardest kind of ending to sit with, because there is no villain to blame and no disaster to mourn. There was only arithmetic, the slow, patient arithmetic of a London property market that made the ground beneath a working brewery worth more than 400 years of work could ever justify. The same family that had saved cask ale, that had saved the Maris Otter barley, that had helped save the Shire horse itself, looked at the numbers and made a choice. Head over heart, as the dying man said, not through catastrophe, through a single, reasonable, devastating calculation. There is a photograph that beer writers love of the brewery offices left exactly as they were on the last day. A foreman's office, still showing a 2006 wall chart. A cup of tea, long since evaporated to a brown ring. A yellowing copy of the Daily Mail. Century-old barley, still sitting in the cast-iron grain hoppers, waiting for a brew that would never come. A place stopped, mid-breath, and left. The horses are gone from the streets of Wandsworth. The Ram no longer grazes in the heart of London. The man in the white suit, who flew fighters over Malta and kept the faith, when the whole industry laughed at him, lies under an oak tree in King George's Park, a beer from his last brew, drunk long ago at his grave. The smell of malt no longer drifts north across the rooftops on a westerly wind, but the engine of 1835 still stands where Wentworth and Sons bolted it down. The beer is being made again, by other hands. And somewhere in the new development, among the luxury flats where the drays once rolled, the River Wandle still runs past the spot where, 4.5 centuries ago, a man named Humphrey Langridge was robbed of something somebody thought worth taking. The Ram never really stopped. It only changed hands, one last time, from a family to a city to whatever comes next.